What's up developers, it's Dari here and welcome back to a new video where we will review the code of a Laravel junior developer. Quick pause, I'm currently working on a new Udemy course where we'll dive into Laravel databases and Eloquent. If you think that there is a topic that should most definitely be included, feel free to drop it down below in the comment section. If you would be interested in the course or want to support the channel, make sure that you follow me on either Twitter, Instagram or YouTube to be the first one to find out when the course gets released. Last week I tweeted out that I was looking for Laravel developers who would like to send their code so I could review them. I got quite some responses and I decided to choose a project where I could add the most review. Quick note, I've made a list of things that I would like to cover and I definitely would have done differently. But that doesn't mean the way the user has done it is wrong. I'm also not here to bash the user, I'm just trying to help you guys out to prevent making common mistakes. The mistakes that I've seen inside this project are mistakes I see quite often. I also won't be running the project inside the browser and I won't cover the blade templates either. I'm strictly going to focus on routing, migrations, middlewares and controllers. So let's start off with the routing. Usually when I spin up a new application, I start inside the web.php file to see the routes that have been defined. So let's open the routes directory and the web.php file. This mostly gives me a clear overview of what's happening inside the application. Now right here, it seems like the routes have been divided into different files, which is a good thing. But the comments right here are kind of bothering me. Using comments is awesome, don't get me wrong, as long as it's useful. Right here, you will find a comment named auth, but we could all see that it's requiring the auth.php file. So I don't really see the point of adding a comment right above it named auth, because we could all tell that authenticated routes are stored right here. So what I would do is just simply delete it. The final user makes sense in my opinion as well, so let's delete that one as well. The same goes for admin routes. The only route where I would understand a comment is the non-categorized routes, but also there, a single route kind of makes sense to me as well because I think that the author is referring to a couple of views that don't really belong anywhere. So I would just delete it as well. I have looked into a couple of routes before and I think that we can get the most out of the admin file. So let's open the web subdirectory and let's open the admin route. And let me close off the sidebar for a moment. I personally think that the comments inside the routes here are useless as well. If we take a look at the first comment, you'll see that it says articles admin index page and it's referring to the admin_index method inside the article controller. So I would just delete these as well. From the start, I can see that almost all routes right here have a middleware of auth change to it, which could be done a lot easier. So let's define a new route right above of it, which will be a grouped route. We need to pass in two parameters right here. The first is an array, while the second one is a callback function. So let's say function. And rather than chaining the middleware auth every single time on all the routes, we could simply say, well, add a key value pair right here, where the middleware is equal to auth. Now we could even add the prefix of admin as well. We could add a second key value pair inside our array where the prefix is equal to admin. Now, since we have added our middleware inside the group, we could delete the middleware on all routes. Now the first three routes that we have inside the prefix are okay, so we could move them inside our grouped route. But looking at all the other routes that we have, I can already tell that something is wrong right here. Why are there so many extra routes for only the admin user? We have a get request to the user's endpoint where it needs to call the admin_index method. The resource route that we have right here already has an index method inside of it. So why not make that one a little bit more complex instead of defining a completely new route and view every single time? So for the sake of this video, we could simply move all these routes above. We could move the /endpoint right here as well. Another point that is important to keep is that the endpoint should either be singular or plural. Now the standard encoding, not only in Laravel, is adding plural endpoints. So you have an endpoint right here named tutorial. So tutorial should be renamed to tutorials, so plural. I've also taken a look at the tutorial.play.php file inside the admin subdirectory, and all the static data that you have defined right there could easily be added inside the database. So what I recommend is simply navigating to iterm, performing the php artisan make controller, named tutorial controller. If it only has one method, you could even make it invocable. Let's leave that aside for now. Hit enter. Our controller has been created, which then allows us to define a new route inside the grouped route, right below the last one, where we could make a GET request to /tutorials. It has a tutorial controller. It has a class, and we're going to use the index method that we haven't defined, and we're going to name it tutorials, which allows us to delete this route right here. Now looking at the last available route that we have right here, it looks like the content of the page is the same as the tutorials route right here that we just defined, but simply has a different language because it has an _fr attached to it. Personally, I would always recommend Laravel localization right here, which is a convenient way to retrieve strings in various languages, rather than defining a static page yourself. I will add the link to localization in the description down below, so please check that out and get rid of what you're doing right here. Now let's define the route for localization, because we could do that. Inside our grouped route, we could say route : get. The URI will be tutorials / a route parameter of locale. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. We could make a call to the tutorial controller, : class, and let's say that we have a method of languages, where we have a named route of tutorials.languages, which then allows us to remove our route that we have right here. Now there's nothing wrong with the users route and the roles route as well, so let's copy these and we can paste them right inside of our grouped route, which wraps up the routing part of this video. Now let's move on to the migrations of this project. Let's open our project, close off the routes, open the database directory, migrations, where you will find a couple migrations. We have the users, password reset, failed jobs, access tokens, a songs table, categories, roles, and articles. 4 above obviously makes sense to me. The first thing that I'm noticing right here is that it's using a category _ID, where the data type is a string. And that's not alright, because you're probably referring to a categories table. It's also not an integer, since a category ID is a foreign key. It represents the ID on the categories table. Let's use our table object right below of it, where we're going to use the foreign ID. The foreign ID will be named category _ID. We're going to chain a method named constraint, which will be categories table. And on delete, we're going to cascade all the data. Now this looks way better. Also, another quick note, I personally find it cleaner to add foreign keys either at the end of a migration or after the primary key. Usually I'll just put it right after the primary key, so we could delete the string category ID that we have. Now the same goes for the user ID that we have defined right at the bottom, so we could say table foreign ID on the column user _ID, constraint the table users, and on delete we will cascade all the data. Once again, we can delete our table integer, which is pretty weird because you used a string for a category ID but an integer for the user ID. So be consistent with what you're doing. If it's an ID, it obviously should be a foreign ID, but it's also an integer and not a string. So let's delete it and let's move our foreign ID back to the top. Alright, I'm also seeing a string of artists right here, which doesn't seem right as well. How do you want to get all songs of one specific artist? The way you have it set up in your migration makes you write more and more code, and you're giving the user the option to add the artist name. And you can't trust users adding the same exact name for every single artist. So what I would recommend is navigating to the CLI, creating a new model in migration by saying PHP artisan make me a new model named artist, and add a -m flag to it for the migration. Navigate back to PHP Storm, open the latest migration, so the create artist table. Let's say that we're only gonna add a new table string of name, close it off. Then inside our create songs table, we could create a new foreign ID for artist _ID, constraint on the table artists, and also on delete, cascade all the data. This allows us to delete our table string of artist, and we can then move our foreign key constraint up to the top. The other thing is important, and in my opinion is missing, is the use of defining extra properties for your columns. With the use of extra properties such as required, nullable, and unique, you're making a stable database design that will prevent you from redundant data, efficiently execute queries, and improve database performance. If your database design isn't right, the code you will write inside your controller and models will also not be right. Now, your entire migration is based on a song, which obviously has a title that should be required. And the slug as well. The slug should be required, and it should also be unique, because you will run into errors when you have a slug that has multiple matches inside the database. For preferences, I would also put the slug right after the title because it's most likely based on the title. Now for the column names, I would also recommend being a little bit more specific. You are very specific when it comes to a song URL, but not so much when it comes to a cover, because it's simply a cover underscore image. Now, I could cover all migrations, but it will take a little bit much time, and I think that with the code that we have improved right here, you should be able to change up all the other migrations yourself as well. If we open our, let's say, categories migration, you'll see that it's using a name, a color, which is alright, but it's using a string of user ID, so this should be a foreign key constraint. The rules is alright. The articles, this should be rechanged to a, well, pretty much what any other migration has, just a table ID. You're using a string of user ID, which should be a foreign key constraint as well. You're having a string of title, body, the article image, you're specific here, and you defined an integer for the user ID, which should be a foreign key constraint as well. So we have created 3 foreign key constraints on the songs table, which means that we need to define the relationships inside the song model as well, because only having a foreign key constraint doesn't make it usable. Let's search for song.php, open the model. I can see that you have defined the relationship between the user and the category, but that doesn't make sense if you have not defined the foreign key constraint properly. The only relationship that is missing is the artist. You have added a column of artists, so singular inside the songs migration, where I'm assuming that one song can only have one artist, unless you write tons of code to add them separately with a comma. But in most cases, there are songs with multiple artists. So what I would do is basically create a new public function, artist, so plural. And let me scroll down, and we're going to return this keyword that has many relationship, and we're going to pass in the artist model. At the top, I saw that you didn't have a fillable property for mass assignment, but the guarded property right here seems incomplete. This could also be me, but I think that if you want to specify which fields are not mass assignable, you should add them inside the bracket as well. If you want to add them all, you should simply add single quotes asterisks. Now that was it for the model. Let's close off all files. And we're going to look at a controller. Let's open the app directory, HTTP controllers, where I'm specifically going to have a look at the web subdirectory and the rule controller. Right here, you will see that an if statement is being performed to check whether the user rule ID is greater than 2. If we navigate down and open our database directory, migrations and users table, you will see that the users table has a column named role ID with a default of 1. But there is also a role migration. There are 2 things that I would recommend right here. The first thing is using an enum over a roles migrations, since the data will always be stored inside your database and not inside your project. So let's do that. Let's create a new directory inside our app directory. Let's name it enums, where we are going to create a new enum named user roles enum.php. Now we need to create the file ourselves, so let's start out with an opening PHP tag. Let's give it a namespace of app\enum. We're going to add the enum keyword. We're going to name it user roles enum. We're going to add 3 cases right here. Case number 1 will be user. Case number 2 is admin. And finally, we have a case called super_admin. Now let's close off our user roles enum and let's navigate back to our role controller. And I've seen this throughout your application where you're performing this check. And even inside the role controller, you could see it in pretty much every function, right? The show edit, update, destroy, and all of them. Now there are two solutions on how you could prevent this. You could create a new middleware that will check the role of a user, or you could define a new method inside your user model which you can access through the user object. Now let's do both and let's see the difference. Starting off with using a method inside our user model. So let's open it and let's scroll to the bottom where we could create a new public function and let's name it isAdmin. Right here, we're going to return either true or false based on the role of a user. If it's an admin or super admin, we're going to return true, otherwise it's false. Which can be done by saying return the auth user role underscore ID if it's equal to the user role enum, and we're going to get the admin case, and if it's auth user role ID is equal to the user role enum, and the case is the super underscore admin. We forgot one thing right here because we need to chain the value of it, which will be the integer. You could add this method inside your role controller as well. And I've looked throughout this project and I've seen that it uses the if statement in a lot of places. So not only the role controller. So I think that the user model is the best place for it. What we could do then inside your controller, pretty much redefining what you have done right here. So let's say that we want to return the authenticated user and we want to get the isAdmin method. If the return value is true, return a view to, let's say, admin.rule.index, and we're going to add with the with method the rules where the values are coming from the user role enum, and we're going to get all cases. So let me outline this on the line below. All right. In case the return value is false, we're going to abort it with a 403, which pretty much allows us to remove the entire if statement. The second method is using a custom middleware. So let's navigate to the CLI and let's perform the PHP artisan make me a new middleware and let's name it check user role, where we could navigate back to PHP Storm, open the middleware directory where you will see our check user role class. Then right above our return statement, we could basically create a new rules array where we have a user inside an array, user role enum. The option is user and we're going to get the value. Then we have the admin, the user role, the user option and the value, comma, we can get the user roles enum again, where we could get the admin value. Finally, we have the super underscore admin, which has a value of user role enum, admin, and we're going to get the value. Then inside our handle method, we could perform a check to see whether the user has the right role or not by creating an if statement. We're going to not check inside an array. We're going to check if the authenticated role ID of a user exists inside the rules. So let's say auth user role underscore ID, comma, array rules. If it passes, we're going to abort it with a 403. We don't need a return statement. Now, before you could use the middleware, you need to register it inside the kernel.php file right at the bottom inside the route middleware, where we could create a new key of check user role, make a call to the check user role middleware class. Now, the downside of using the middleware is that inside your admin.php file in your routes, let me open it. Our current routes group has a middleware of auth. So you can't add multiple values right here, obviously, but that would mean that all routes will implement the check user role middleware. And since the user of this project performs the check in multiple controllers, but not in every method, you could define two new group routes, where all the routes will be stored where the user is an admin. So let's define it right above. Let's say route : group. It has a middleware, which is equal to another array where we're going to pass in the auth and the check user role, whether it's an admin or not. We're going to add a callback function. So function parentheses curly braces, where we're going to move the rules resource right inside of it. But whenever a role is equal to admin, we will only give them access to the index and show method, which I have seen before because the index method and the show method checks for ID number 2. Now you could create another route as well. Well, let's actually duplicate it. where we will check for the super_admin rule, and we're going to give the user access to, let's say, the create method, the store method, edit method, update method, and the destroy method. Now we could even simplify our rule controller, the index method, what we have right here, to return a view of admin.rule.index with the rules which are coming from the user rules enum. So we could delete the return statement that is checking whether a user is an admin or not. Our middleware will check inside the admin.php file what the role is, and it's giving access to the view. The one thing that I'm noticing right here, and I don't know the entire scope of the project, is that you're returning a view of admin.role.index, meaning that you probably have created static pages for all rules. This is something that you should prevent with the data, where you could simply return back one single view for every single rule, but the data will change based on the rule. Now if we scroll down, you will see that the create method performs the same check, which we could remove, where we could simply return the view. We could delete the entire if statement. We also don't need to abort because that will happen right inside of the middleware. The store method uses the same exact check right here, which you can delete. So let's do that first. We don't need the else statement. All right. Now personally, I'm a fan of separating validation from the controller since the validation needs to be done inside a request. So let's navigate to the CLI. Perform the PHP artisan make me a new request named store user request. Let's navigate back to PHP Storm. Let's open the, give me a moment, the request subdirectory store user request, where we need to change the return value of the authorized method to true so that the user is authorized to make this request, where inside the rules method we could simply define the rule where the name is required. If we then navigate back to our role controller, we could remove the entire validation that we have because we're not going to use the request class, but we're going to use the store user request. We do need to validate it by saying, well, get me the request, validate it. Now after the validation, we're ready to create a new role, but instead of using the all method, we're going to use the only method, and we're only going to request the name. The reason why I don't want to use the all method is because you can't trust users and you don't know what's coming in. Let's redefine our redirect as well by saying return a redirect to the route of rules.index, but we're going to add a message to it because you obviously need to tell a user whether the creation of a new role was successful or not. So let's say message, and the value is role has been created. So let's delete the entire route that we have. The show method could be redefined as well. So we don't need to check, and we also don't need to abort. All right. The edit method could be changed as well. We don't need to check, and the else statement. All right. Then we have the update method, where I recommend using a new custom request, but since it's using the same role as a store role request, we could simply use that instead of creating a complete new class. So let's replace the request with the store user request. And if you have time, just rename it to store or update user request. We don't need the if statement and the request validation. We don't need the else statement. We do need to validate our incoming data by saying request validated. We're once again not going to update all values, but only the name. We will return a redirect, but with a message once again saying rule has been updated. Now let me align it. Now let's have a look at the last method, which is the destroy method. We once again don't need the if statement. And this looks all right, so we could leave it as it is. So let's only add a with message right here named rule has been deleted. Now keep in mind that it is debatable if using an enum is the best solution right here, since you can create roles through an interface. I still think it is, because it eliminates all the static numbers when checking for a role ID. I also think that we cleaned up the controller quite a bit. We don't have that much code for a CRUD controller. This application has tons of files and I can't cover them all, but I want to point out some important things I see junior developers doing wrong. The first thing that is bothering me is inside the controllers folder where he has a tutorial controller, which is completely empty. If you don't use a controller, model, migration, middleware, or whatever, just delete it. If we then open the auth subdirectory inside the controllers directory, you will see that it consists of an auth controller file. Now, I don't see the point of adding a subdirectory right here of auth if the name of your controller is the same. If you name your controller the same and put all the authentication methods right inside one single file. What I recommend doing is simply making a login controller and a register controller. Just follow the Laravel Breeze controller naming conventions right here. Also, another recommendation is to use Laravel its method naming convention. Inside the auth controller, you have a login method, which actually shouldn't be login because the login is actually the auth method, which will check the credentials of a user and sees whether a user can log in or not. While down below, you have a logout method, which is alright. You have a register method, which actually should be the new method of view, where you validate the incoming data and create a new user. And even the return view can be put inside the register function. Now this was it for this video, where we covered the migrations, routing, model, and controller of the code that has been sent in from a junior Laravel developer. If you want to see more content like this, let me know in the description down below so I could do more code reviews. If you do like my content and you want to see more, leave this video a thumbs up, and if you're new to this channel, please hit that subscribe button.